Hello and welcome back to a second week of going over some picks with Scott here from Picker's Paradise. This week I brought in a few different things for you. And as things go with this show, you'll find out that not everything I bring in is vintage or antique. In a picker's life, you run into a lot of cool things that are sometimes contemporary that you just need to take a shot on and take with you, and that are pretty cool pieces. So I got one of those with me too, and we'll discuss that today as well. But first, we're going to start off, we're going to talk about some bottles today. First one I got here to talk to you about. This one here is a Nashua bottle from the J.H. Field. It says High Street, Nashua, New Hampshire on it. The bottle, as you can see, it might have some mold lines on it. So it was actually made in somewhat of a mold. It has a nice flat bottom that would be attributed with making it in a mold. There is no holes or anything, pontil marks from a hand-blown bottle on this one. The circle or the oval that the J.H. Fields is in is actually a little bit indented, so it would have been a positive mold there. And then the J.H. Field, the High Street, and the Nashua, New Hampshire parts, all those are embossed. So those would have been indented into the mold that this thing was blown into. And as you start looking at the bottle, the mold lines go up the sides, but not all the way to the top. And we'll talk more about that later and about what that means when we start talking about the aging of bottles and things of that nature. But for right now, we'll talk a little bit more about J.H. Field. So J.H. Field was an agent and a distributor for a number of beer producing companies in the area. They worked for and distributed bottles or beer for the Frank Jones Brewery in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and also from an ad I found, the Anheuser-Busch Company of St. Louis, Missouri, which we all know is the Budweiser company today. But it's interesting to note that the 1906 ad I found for the J.H. Field Company, where it mentioned Anheuser-Busch as being an agent for that company, the spelling of Anheuser was actually different than what you'll find today. It had an A instead of an E in the Hauser part of it. So it was Anhauser, not the E that you'd find in there today. So other than that, J.H. Fields, it says High Street. I did a little research, some of the ads and some of the city directories from back in the early 1900s pointed to the fact that it was at 22 High Street. If you look at a map currently today, that 22 High Street area is approximately where the taxi stand is, across from the High Street parking garage. I'm assuming that back at the turn of the 1900s, there was something different there, probably built up in that parking lot area where the taxi stand is currently. I'm not thinking that that was the sole building that he was distributing both Frank Jones and Anheuser-Busch out of simultaneously for the Nashua area. I think it would probably be a little small. In addition, J.H. Field was also a man about town. So he also was a resident here in Nashua. He actually built the home that's at 1 East Dunstable Road here in Nashua in 1905. He was also a vice president of the Nashua Coal Company. And he also, in the 1880s, owned a business producing shoes somewhere on Main Street as well. So, guy's been in town a lot, and this bottle is a pretty cool reminder of those times back in the day. There was also ads as late as 1913 that I found for the bottling company. So, the bottling seems to have taken place probably in the maybe late 1800s through probably 1913, 1915 area, probably about a 20-year span at least from the records and the information I could find so far. The 1913 ad, though, was kind of funny. I am a big fan of quack medicine, which is basically a term used for medicines that were basically unproven. People had made them over time. You find a lot of these in the 1800s. Medicines and bottles that will say they cure everything from heart disease to balding, any kind of skin disease. just these random cure-alls that say they'll do anything. Well, J.H. Field was also one of those, at least distributor for something that they were called Anima Bitters, which they characterized as a unique medical wine. So I can only imagine it probably tasted horrible, and it probably got you drunk, and you probably didn't feel too bad after having it, but I'm not sure it really cured much of anything. Now the second bottle we got here, this one's kind of cool. It's not a Nashua bottle. I like bringing in, Nashua pieces whenever I can, but this one's from Manchester, and the difference with this one here, the big difference is that this one has the distributor's name on it of Homan and Bartlett, who were a distributor for Schlitz. As you can see on the J.H. Fields bottle, there's no real name of the beer or substance that's actually inside. Sometimes there were paper labels which would be placed on the back side of where the embossing was. Other times they would just reuse the bottles, and they were distributing for multiple people, and bottles were probably not as cheap as they are today to be manufactured. So back in the day it was not very rare, but it was definitely a little bit more rare to see the actual name of a product on a distributor bottle. And when I started looking into the Homan and Bartlett Company of Manchester, I was able to find a little bit on them too. From some business records I found, there was definitely a deal for them to be the Schlitz distributor from 1900 to about 1903. Doesn't mean that's the only time period that they were a distributor for Schlitz. And they were listed in the Manchester City Directory of 1915, meaning that the company was at least in business until then. I couldn't find a whole lot of information about the company existing beyond that time frame. As you can see, this bottle is a little different than the other one. The Nashua bottle we had here, it has a little bit more of a normal crown top that you'd see on the bottles that you'd buy at a convenience store, grocery store today, with the tin or metal cap pressed onto the top of it or screwed onto the top. This one has more of a just blob type top with a little bit of a metal hasp still here from the enclosure or the stopper that would have gone on the top of this bottle. So one thing we're going to do now, we've kind of talked about the history of these individual bottles, is we're going to get into a little bit of the history of bottles themselves and also about how to date some of the bottles that you find in the field or anywhere for that matter. So the first bottle actually discovered, which I think it was dug up somewhere in the Poland area over in Europe. They were able to date it back, I think carbon date most likely, back to about 1500 BC. So glass making is definitely not something that is new, as most of you might know. It's been around for a long, long time. The first real manufacturing of glass bottles started, they think, around 100 BC, where there were actually companies who would actually produce glass products for use. And the first bottles that were made in the United States were actually made in the 1600s, back when it was just Jamestown Colony, before it was much of a country at all. So there have been bottles in the United States for as long as there have basically been the United States. So the easiest way to date bottles is to actually look at their physical characteristics. So back in the 1800s, up until about 1870s, all the bottles until then were all hand blown, at least to start with. And then there were different tooled lips. So the way to be able to age the bottles is by the tops on them, and then also some of the other characteristics of the bottle, as we were talking about. Hand-blown bottles will actually have open ponto marks on the bottom where you can actually see like the glass was actually snapped off, like a glass blower was actually working on them. These are definitely not the case. These are older bottles that were machine molded, at least the bottom and the sides. Now, from 1830 to 1850, there were flared lip bottles, which basically means as the bottle was blown, they created a bottle to come up, and they basically, as the bottle was ending, they basically just smushed the top down, basically just flared the lips of the bottle out and kind of rolled them over just a little bit to actually create a spot for a stopper or a cork to go in there. They also, in that same time frame, had sheared lip bottles, which sounds just like it is. They literally blew the bottle out into a shape, and they literally just cut the top off. So it basically had a rough sheared top for the most part that would take, again, a stopper or a cork. Moving into the 1840s up to the 1860s, they started having some in-rolled lips. So basically the same concept we were talking about with the flared lip, except for this time, when the glass was molded up, they would roll the glass inside, create a smaller diameter hole for a stopper or a cork again. 1840 to 1870, there were a whole bunch of different styles of bottles around. These ones are much more common when you're going around looking at things. There's an applied round band top on bottles. So basically the way I picture and look for the applied round band is basically it kind of looks like someone took a half-eaten or half-sucked-on Lifesaver and just kind of stuck it around the top of the bottle. It's a rounded lip that basically just goes all the way around it. There's an applied square band, which you're thinking square, okay, the bottle's round, how are you going to put a square lip on there? No, it's not that at all. The square actually refers to the fact that, like we talked about the one just a second ago, they look more like a Lifesaver with the rounded edges. These ones would have a squared off edge at the top and around the rim at the bottom. So they basically took a squared off, nice and round piece of glass and stuck that on there. A little bit more sophisticated, I guess, maybe a little more manufactured than the round top, the round band top. Then there was also an applied taper. This bottle here, this Schlitz bottle, is semi-reminiscent of that. It doesn't really have quite the drastic angle that most of the taper bottles would have. But the taper bottles would typically have like a cone-shaped top on them where the hole at the top of the bottom where the lip is actually a little bit wider, and the glass kind of flares out and cones out and around the rim of the, around the neck of the bottle. Then one of my favorites, the Blob top, which this one is kind of a blob top as well. And a blob top just means that it looks like someone just took a bunch of glass and kind of stuck it around there. It's a big blob sitting there with a hole in the middle that they put your cork or stopper into. You see a lot of these. They're pretty common, especially for decoration and things like that, because they just give that old, really handmade look to the bottle. And then there's also a bunch of different double collars that they started coming out with in this time. So sometimes you'd have a tapered collar that actually like has like a tapered collar underneath it almost. It looks like there's like two ridges where there's like two cones kind of like inside of each other. You'll find ones with a couple different round bands stuck on the top too. Sometimes a smaller one at the top, larger one underneath, almost kind of like how the Crown top bottle here has a smaller round top and then another round segment here. So that's kind of like how the double collars were working in that time. And sometimes you'd have like a mix and match. Sometimes it would be a round with a square or a square with a round. Sometimes it's a blob with a little bit of a round underneath it, like a little collar underneath it. Sometimes the double collar was to help hold on to the metal hasps and other parts that were attached to the bottle. And other times it was just merely for looks or aesthetics, or basically for brand recognition. A lot of times back in the day, a lot of the companies would come up with these new innovations to try to get people to buy their bottles, claiming it would work better in some way or be more robust. Because like I said, a lot of times back in these days, a lot of the bottles would have marks on them that said return to distributor, return to manufacturer. So they could actually reuse them, refill them, and send them back out to customers or stores to be sold to customers. So moving into the 1870s to 1910 time frame, this is when you started getting the tooled bottles. This is when the science and technology got to the point where they figured out that they could blow the glass into molds and create standards or more standard size bottles, whereas before when you're hand blown bottles, try to get a 10-ounce bottle every time. You're not going to get a 10-ounce bottle every time. You're going to be at 11, 10, 9. So when you mold the bottle, there's a little bit more consistency in the volume expected in the bottle. And it also helped manufacturers to be able to tell the customer, it's guaranteed you're going to get 10 ounces in this bottle. And a lot of times in the bottles in those time frames, in the 1870s to 1910s, and even a little bit beyond there, you will see guaranteed on the bottle somewhere. And that guarantee is talking about that the volume inside is actually what they say you're going to get. Because a lot of times it was kind of hit and miss. So the tooled bottles from the 1870s to the 1910s, they didn't have the technology down completely at this time. So it's funny because actually both these bottles are from basically that time frame. They do have molded sides on them. There are lines, mold lines, that run up both sides of these bottles. The Schlitz bottle is a little funny because as you get to the top of the bottle here, there's a little bit of a mismatch where the bottle was put together, and there's some very high bumpy mold lines on the sides. And so typically that's something that is characteristic of bottles that were basically made before 1920, when the whole molding process was something new. So the flash sometimes along the sides where their seams are is high. Sometimes they're kind of off center a little bit. The mold lines are much bigger and more noticeable in the bottles that are prior to 1920. But as you can see on both of these bottles, that the mold lines, they run out as you get towards the top of the neck of the bottle and the lip of the bottle. So what they would do is actually mold the bottles to that point and then hand finish the rest of the bottle. As you can see, this one has, like I said, a little bit more of a blob top, I'd call it probably. And this one has a crown top, which was a newer technology. And the crown tops, they really didn't start until 1890. So this Nashua bottle, you can almost guarantee is probably somewhere between that 1890 date, maybe closer to the 1910 date or so. And it also fits up perfectly with the information found online about what they were doing in that time period too. So in that same time period, the J.H. Field Company, around 1900, 1910, they were distributing beer for a couple different beer companies. This bottle most likely had some Frank Jones from Portsmouth in it or some Anheuser-Busch from St. Louis in it. Now this Schlitz bottle, it's the same thing, maybe a little bit older because you got the tooled rim up here, the hand-tooled rim, or neck and lip. So this one is probably a little bit on the older side, I'd have to say. It might be the same time period as this bottle. It might be a little bit earlier because of the way that the top is made. But basically you can't really say. If you're going to date a bottle like these, typically you have to go with what the technology was, give it a wide time frame. You can narrow it down a little bit based on when the companies were in business and that type of thing. But yeah, basically the more information you can find, more different areas, whether it be ads, and then also the bottle information from the history itself, really gives you a fully rounded idea of when the bottle was made, what it was used for. So moving on, now 1860 to 1910, they started making screw-on bottles, screw-on cap bottles. Now, it's not the screw-on cap bottles that you'd picture today. So the way they were making them up until actually 1960 when screw top bottles became the standard. And we'll talk more about that in a second. But prior to that time, the original screw top bottles were actually molded or handmade with the screw in it, and they'd actually literally just cut it off. So if you find old screw top bottles, the top of the lip is actually going to be, you can actually see where it was hand cut. It might be a little bit rough to the touch actually. Most of the time they finish it off a little bit, but you'll be able to notice that it was actually cut off. Those are very rare. You don't find a lot of those. I don't think I've ever seen too many of them. Sometimes the screw is inside, which is typical. You don't see many with the screw outside like we see today. So moving on to 1915. So as we talked about the crown top bottles before, so the crown top really took off in 1915. So once that time period hit, it's not that any bottles being made were all crown tops. It was just the majority of them. So you still find bottles made after 1915 with the blob tops and the taper tops and all kinds of stuff like that. So just because a bottle has an older style top on it, it does not mean that that bottle is necessarily that age. It could be something that is a lot newer, but just made in that style, maybe by somewhere that had less technology and that kind of thing. And as I said, in the 1960s, that's basically when your screw-on crown top that we see today on most sodas and beers, that's when that came into popularity. It was when there was finally an industry standard on the size of bottles, things like that. Manufacturers were all getting together and creating industry standards. And after that time, pretty much a lot of the bottles that you find post-1960s, the values are relatively low compared to things you find prior to that. All right. So, bottle condition. So, the things you want to look for with bottles, especially the ones that are older, is there's manufacturing defects. When bottles were manufactured back in the day, the hand-blown ones, you're going to find a lot more of the bubbles and inclusions that you find in hand-blown glass. As you can see here, the Schlitz one's got a couple nice big bubbles on the side of it. It's got a nice big one in the back. Sometimes the bubbles actually end up being open on the bottles, whether the opening is on the inside or the outside. Sometimes if it's on the outside, it can get a little rough, a little chipped up, a little abrased. And there's also instances of non-fill. One of the things you find a lot with older bottles is the fact that they won't sit flat because they were basically handmade. So if the guy was a little off that day, maybe a little off to the left, every bottle was off to the left, and it didn't quite sit flat. So when you're looking at the actual condition of the bottles, one thing you have to realize with a lot of bottles that are even 1950s and before is you're going to find them, a lot of them were dug up, basically. So people used to throw them away, and the only way that a lot of them are around today is because people go out and hunt for dump sites where bottles were dumped over the decades and centuries, I guess, at this point, and take them back, clean them up, and sell them. So these two, I can pretty much guarantee you, were dug bottles. I think I bought these in a large dug bottle collection I had bought at one point. When I bought the collection, these bottles would have been possibly half full of dirt, and also just absolutely dirty and disgusting. So when it comes to cleaning or actually we're going to talk about defects for one more second. So the defects that you want to look for when you're looking at bottles, now this J.H. Field one, this one's a little beat up. It's got a nice crack right here. Cracks are something that you find relatively often. If it's a bad crack, you know, it's probably not worth much. You also find some chips. There's a nice big chip right there out of the corner right on this seam. And this right here, this is actually a bruise. Now I refer to bruises as like the love child of cracks and chips. It's basically a chip that never cracked its way out of the glass. So those are on a lot of these bottles that you find dug as well, because they were literally just thrown in the trash. And we're banging around with other bottles, metals, who knows what over time, getting run over by construction equipment, Lord knows what. So there's another bruise right there on the back of it as well. One of the other things you find with a lot of these bottles that were dug up too is staining on the bottles. A lot of times they were buried with metals and other things. So there you will find some metal staining. And the one thing with metal staining is that most of the time it is pretty much removable. As you can see, even this one with the hasp around the end, around the top of it, still doesn't have a whole lot of metal staining down the sides of it or anything like that. It's pretty much all been cleaned off. This bottle here, I don't know how well you can see it, but there's a little bit of a white, kind of almost like metallic look to the inside of the bottle. And that is typically what we call sickness. Now, bottle sickness is created by chemicals leaching into and out of the glass over time as it's buried. So that actually causes the clouding. It's something that's pretty much irreversible. I have not found a way, at least, to reverse it yet. If anybody has any ideas, let me know. But yeah, so we are actually wrapping up on time already. It was a quick episode this week. But next week, I'm actually going to come back and we'll do some more bottle talk. I'll give you my secrets on how to clean bottles. It is one of the comments I get pretty often in my shop and when I'm around is people are amazed at how clean I get the bottles I have that have been dug up over time. So we'll come back and we'll talk about that. And I'll also talk about this beautiful wooden bowl that is something that is not vintage or antique, but has a great local story. And I look forward to seeing you guys again next week.